So your book is really essentially about the UK enabling financial crime. And, I feel that particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we hear all about like oligarchs, or we'll hear about corruption in different countries, say African countries, and how corrupt this country is, etc. But there really doesn't seem to be a ton of awareness or consciousness about where this corruption is engendered and where it's allowed. And your book sheds a light on that. So it really starts at the top, and the UK is a place where that is fostered. So can you talk a bit about the genesis of your idea?
Yeah, so I'm a Russianist, a Russophile. I moved to Russia in my very early 20s, just because I'd always been fascinated by Russia and Eastern Europe. And I decided when I finished university that I'd just move and live in Russia and work there and try and find a job. And I became a journalist writing about, day-to-day events. And I suppose I'd had this kind of rather naive idea that what I'd be writing about would be the development of democracy. It obviously, Russia had been an authoritarian country forever. And yet in the 1990s, for the first time, it had sort of proper elections and proper media and kind of independent business people and all that. And it was exciting. And obviously, spoiler, I didn't end up writing about the development of democracy. Just it must have been 3 weeks or so before I arrived, Vladimir Putin became prime minister, and he's been, prime minister or president ever since. And gradually, at first, but increasingly quickly, I suppose, in the last few months, he's been stifling any kind of sign of, civil society or freedom or democracy, ruthlessly. So I ended up obviously writing about that because that was what was going on. But it's very difficult to, I'm in Russia or any other country in the former Soviet Union without coming across corruption. You get shaken down on the street by police officers or coming to the airport by customs officers or whoever. It's a fact of life. And it became increasingly clear to me that corruption was more than just a kind of street level thing. It was a phenomenon that really encompassed the whole state. The state had been transformed into this extractive machine to take money from its own citizens. And that, Putin essentially sits at the top of this pyramid of theft that's just taking away everything. And this very small group of are all basically men around Putin have become incredibly wealthy. The inequality in Russia is really off the charts. So, that struck me after many years writing about Russia in the former Soviet, the most important thing that was happening, the fact that the government, though they posed as these kind of nationalists, had essentially transformed the state into a looting machine. And you don't need to start looking at that very long, realizing that they didn't do this on their own, right? Because where does the money end up? Well, the money ends up being spent on super yachts and mansions, football clubs, the general bling of the international super rich. And so, I wrote a book about that called Moneyland, which was about this sort of global kleptocracy machine. But it struck me that there was this aspect of this phenomenon that I hadn't properly explored in Moneyland, which is the fact that whatever the scam or whatever the scheme, there is always a British angle. It might be a shell company is British, which is, the biggest ever money laundering scandal with $230 billion moved via Danske Bank, its Estonian branch, mostly hidden behind British shell companies. It might be a British lawyer, arranging business affairs for an oligarch. It might be a mansion which has been sold to an oligarch where he lives or keeps his mistress. It might be a British school that's educating his children. It might be a British politician that's serving on the board or chairing the board of his company. Whatever it is, there's an oligarch. Somewhere there's a Brit. And that phenomenon struck me as sufficiently appalling from a British perspective, so sufficiently kind of interesting from a global of how the global criminal economy works, that it struck me as worth writing a book about. And it turned out to be a far more interesting given it credit for. This goes back further than I thought it did, and really is one of the keys standing how ruling classes of places like Nigeria or Russia, Azerbaijan, China, Argentina have really been able to, for so long, been able to their countries with total impunity and steal this unbelievable sums of cash and stash it offshore and then spend it in property because they've had so much help, and primarily they've had help from people in the city of London in the UK.
And I mean, you mentioned Russia and like kind of this economy of corruption that has been created in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, part of that has to be too just shock doctrine capitalist politics, right? Where essentially the dominant players of the United States, and maybe you could include Britain in this, I'm not sure what your research found here, saw an opportunity to westernize Russia to a degree, bring in a lot of capitalist industry, and it was the shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein puts it. Would you see that as a commonality in Russia and other countries that are deemed as corrupt are Western influence that has created that kind of corrupt economy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the sort of Jeffrey Sachs and the US advisor who helped create the Russian economic model get a lot of criticism, not least from Naomi Klein in the Shock Doctrine, which remains. I reread it recently. It remains an amazingly compelling book. But they had they were only able to do that because there was a cadre of Russians within government in the early 1990s who really wanted to transform their economy, and they had a plan. It was you could argue about whether it was a fair plan, but it was a coherent plan to try and break the back of communism. The idea being that if they property out the door as they could by just privatizing everything quickly. Now, the privatization auctions might be unfair, they might be whatever, but if they could get the property out the door, that would create a property owning class. Once you have a property owning class, they're going to demand free and fair court proceedings to defend their property. If there are going to be free and fair court proceedings, they're going to demand influence over lawmaking process. And then you end up essentially with democracy, the logic being that private property is going to be the fixed point from which you destroy the authoritarian state and build democracy. Now, it may or may not have been a good plan, but it was a plan. The problem with what Britain and the other offshore centers did is they allowed the oligarchs who were created in that first privatization progress to essentially short circuit the entire step-by-step nature of that plan, because they got the property, they took it outside Russia, they invested it in London, and they've gone all the way around to the end. They've got the rule of law in London. They've got democracy in London. They don't need to build that at home. They don't need to go through the messy, annoying, boring process of building democracy and the rule of law, because we sold it to them. So essentially what you ended up with, because of the role of London, particularly London, I mean, Switzerland, the US, some other places had a go, but London was really the driver when it came to accepting Russian wealth, is what it did is it allowed the oligarchs who'd got this money, these rigged privatization, to sidestep the entire Russian political legal process, to put their money in London and then essentially to become colonies of their own nation, because they use their offshore power and offshore to predate on people in their own, because they didn't care anymore about the courts. They didn't care if the courts were fair or not, because they were just using them as weapons against other people. They weren't themselves, because their wealth was outside the country. They didn't care about the fairness of the process that was, because they weren't subject to Russian laws they had elsewhere. They didn't care about the fact that the roads were collapsing, the schools were collapsing, the hospitals were collapsing. They had, their children were being educated abroad, they went to hospitals abroad, and so on. So essentially, by providing these offshore to the oligarchs, it allowed them to become the military colonizers of Russia, which created this particularly nasty form of kleptocracy that you get in Russia now. So obviously, sort of the US advisors to those early Russian politicians do share an aspect of the blame for having helped create this system. But really, it's the fact that the first beneficiaries of this privatization program, were able to immediately opt out of any kind of Russian process thereafter, is what really doomed Russia. And that phenomenon, it wasn't exactly the same in the other countries of the former Soviet Union, but you get broadly similar, the same dynamic, because as soon as someone has got a fortune, they can take it out of the country and then just essentially enjoy it overseas. They go all the way to, like they're playing Stakes and Ladders, they can go all the way to 100 with their first roll. And we see exactly the same process in the former colonies of say, Africa or Southeast Asia, Nigeria, again, the ruling elite was able to take the money out in exactly the same way that the British used to do to Nigeria. They extracted the wealth. The new post-independence ruling elite did the same thing. They extracted the wealth, and they brought it, ironically enough, the same places where the British used to take it, to London. So you ended up with essentially the kind of plumbing of the British Empire being repurposed, not for British people to extract wealth from all over the world, but for other people to extract wealth. But from a British perspective, it didn't really care. We didn't really care who the money belonged to, because if it came here, we could earn fees from moving it around. So, I mean, that's essentially the role London has played as this kind of offshore playground for anyone with money to come to. And the great difference, you know, wondering what's the difference? What's London got that New York doesn't have? It's more what does New York have that London doesn't have, which is that New York has got the FBI. So if you put money in the US, there is a not inconsiderable chance, if you are, you know, egregiously corrupt, that you will be investigated and prosecuted. That doesn't happen here. You know, we have a vanishingly small chance you commit a crime that you will be noticed, or you will be investigated or prosecuted. Even if you are, the chances are the case will fall apart. So it's a playground, really, for anyone with wealth. Your money is safe, it's protected by British courts, the British authorities, and it's never really going to be investigated. So who wouldn't want to bring their money here?